Hello, and welcome to Daybreak Star radio station, our very first book club interview. So happy to have the two of you here. My name is Nat Thornton, and I'm going to be coordinating the book club going forward. But would you guys mind introducing yourselves and giving us a little bit of background? Tony, if you'd like to go first.
Actually, Mike, why don't you go first?
Yeah. My name is Mike Wilson, Thorn Autumn Nation. I'm a human rights activist here in the Tucson area. I've been doing social justice work for about 25 years. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm Tony Lucero. I'm a Chicano scholar of indigenous politics. I teach at the University of Washington, where I'm the chair of the Comparative History of Ideas Department, and I also have affiliations in international studies and in American Indian studies and geography. I grew up on the El Paso, Texas, Ciudad Juarez, Isleta del Sur people borderlands, and I have been here in Seattle for about 16 years.
Wonderful. And today we are here to discuss your guys' newest book, What Side Are You On? It's so exciting. Mike, would you mind telling us a little bit about your military service, which is featured pretty predominantly in this book?
Let me move this phone around. I don't like that propeller. Yeah.
No.
Maybe I'm not going to be able to do it.
No, that works, Mike. Now, who's the helicopter pilot?
There it is. Okay, you know what? A little bit better.
Yeah, that works.
Here we go.
Yeah, what was your question again? I'm sorry.
Your military service features fairly heavily in this book. I was wondering if you would be able to tell us a little bit about that.
What in particular? That's
one of the things that struck me most was the way that you spoke about how the Cold War propaganda influenced your views on communism and fascism. For those of us who aren't of that era, can you tell us a little bit about how that influenced your views?
what I say in the book. I'm a product of the 50s. I was born in 1949. And so my formative years, I grew up in Ajo, which was a mining company town. So I'm a product of the 50s. That was the MacArthur era, the anti-communist hysteria dominated the majority of that decade. And so I grew up in an era. I did not grow up on the reservation. I grew up off the reservation. I'm what we call urban Indians. So I was surrounded by this anti-communist hysteria, whether it was in the movies that I would go to frequently in Ajo, and even to the point comic books in the 1950s were very common. And so a lot of my reading, not a lot, but a lot of those comic books, this was just following the Korean War era, 1950, 51, 1953. So that was in the air. And I was a product of that cultural environment. And so whether I like it or not, I have to acknowledge that formed a lot of my thinking during that period. And then enter the 1960s. Just prior to the Vietnam War era. And also the fact that like many Native American veterans, we are products of our fathers. My father was a World War II veteran.
Mm-hmm.
And so I grew up listening in the indigenous oral tradition to his war stories. And so you have this combination in the macro picture, the cultural environment that I was growing up in, and in the micro scene, listening to my father, who was an infantryman during World War II and served honorably like many awesome people did. We served disproportionate to our numbers. Indigenous people in this country, we've always served with distinction disproportionately in military service. So I grew up in the home listening to those stories from literally at the knees of my father. And so I was formed. To answer your question, I hope I've answered your question. These were the predominant factors that sort of influenced me as I approached adulthood.
Gotcha. Thank you. Tony, could you talk a little bit about like the historical uses of and functions of nationalistic versus patriotic propaganda during wartime, and how this influences the people's view on the other or the enemy?
That's another big question. I think that one thing that we need to really recall is that the formation of the United States it really cannot be understood without thinking about conflict against Indian nations. In fact, in many ways, many scholars have made this point that the Indian Wars never really ended, and you can think even a document like the Declaration of Independence, where the so-called merciless savages are named as one of the reasons that the colonists need to be free from Great Britain, because the king has incited the merciless savagery of the indigenous peoples. So in a way, the formation of the United States is a byproduct of conflict with indigenous peoples, and that serves as a sort of template that will continue beyond those early days. So just to give you one example, it's remarkable how indigenous names are all over military helicopters, military missiles, tomahawks. That's sort of a kind of archaeological linguistic evidence of the way that these earlier conflicts with native peoples continues to think about us and them kind of formulations whenever we have these kind of conflicts. Again, not a coincidence that when the United States SEAL team assassinated Osama bin Laden, when they killed him, that was codenamed Geronimo. So there's these moments where these kinds of colonial continuities come up into view, and what they do is they kind of remind us that this is one of the things that nationalism always kind of does. It reinforces that line between us and them. Who that us and them has changed over different moments. Indigenous people are clearly part of it. Chinese exclusion is clearly part of it. Anti-Mexican feelings, in the Southwest, clearly part of it. So there are these different moments, and of course, anti-Black racism is another part of it. But so these different groups kind of come in and out in different moments, but reinforcing that line between who belongs and who doesn't.
Gotcha. Thank you. Referring back to Tony, another question for you. How do you think colonial violence and classism has affected the way that Central and South American migrants are viewed versus migrants from Europe? We do have a lot. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, that's another great question, and it's really complicated. It's one of the great virtues of Mike's story, which I know we're going to get to into more detail in a bit, but. Mike's experience in Central America really allowed us to really kind of connect some of these dots, because to understand colonialism, we really have to understand that these are global phenomenons. These are hemispheric phenomenons. So the fact that we are still reckoning with native peoples moving across borders, responding to displacement and dispossession. I mean, that's in some ways that's the original colonial story. Other people coming to force people out of their lands. That's something that began, over 500 years ago and continues up to the present. And what's interesting, though, back to your question, is we don't see the reality often in a very clear-eyed way, right? Mm-hmm. So people coming from Europe, that's those kinds of migrants are fine. Those folks who came, those stories of mobility are okay. But native peoples and other black and brown peoples who come from the South, that's different. So it's a very a strange kind of understanding. And a lot of the nations of immigrants kind of discourse also serves to obscure, again, the indigenous reality of the continent where we are. So a lot of this is ideology. A lot of this is the kind of the Mayflowerization of thinking about who actually counts as a U.S. citizen. But one of the great things about Mike's story is it allows us to kind of see how these things continue into present day.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that. Mike, I want to dig into a little bit more about your military service. In particular, you spent time in El Salvador. The military is traditionally a top-down hierarchy in which you are, told orders, told the way that things need to go, and then it's just done without question or with the discouragement, unfortunately, of questions. Can you talk about how your time in the military affected your ability to change and recontextualize some of your beliefs, like in particular around communism and or fascism?
Yeah. Let me just add this. Yes, the military is a hierarchy, but it's not an absolute one. Mm-hmm. This may surprise you to say. We as military members, we have the right to disobey orders.
Did not know that.
Yeah. That's according to the Geneva Conventions. If we think an order is unlawful, immoral, we have the right to disobey those orders. And so I know the common perception is that, as you stated, it's an absolute authoritarian regime. Now, having said that, what was your question again?
So having come from a place where traditionally it's considered top down, did that encourage you to, did you maybe want to buck against that a little bit to be able to, based on what you're seeing on the ground versus what you're being told from your commanders, those might be two different things, and how that might have led you to a different way of thinking about the El Salvadorian people or the conflict in general?
No, the sense of hierarchy, this sense of following orders was always in the back of my mind. Foremost for me was as a Native American, mm-hmm. as a person of color and as a warrior. Volunteering to work among other people of color who were much poorer than I ever was growing up. I grew up extremely poor. But when I was in El Salvador, Honduras, and Bolivia, many times working with indigenous peoples, our poverty was nothing compared to theirs. I had a job to do. I had orders to follow, but I also had a conscience. Mm-hmm. I had a conscience before my military service, formed in large part by extreme poverty. But I went anyway because I wanted to experience firsthand, again, growing up at my father's feet, this Native American warrior. I wanted to earn what he had earned that for indigenous peoples, indigenous men and women, veterans are esteemed in our communities. And I was lacking that recognition. And I wanted to honor my people and my elders and my veterans. I wanted it to be part of that warrior society. I want to be part of that warrior clan. I want to be part of that warrior protective of the people society. And so the only way that I could do it was to volunteer for a combat zone.
Okay.
So, those are my compelling reasons. I had a military career, but it was unfulfilled. It was unfulfilled until you're in a combat zone. Until then, you're comfortable.
Mm.
And you're comfortable and you're complacent. Mm. And so I was sick and tired of being comfortable and complacent. You know, I hadn't been tested. And that's where the testing comes from of yourself. It's a matter of worthiness. Can you call yourself a warrior?
Myself.
That sort of here, but mainly here. Had to be tested. You have to be tested by fire.
Yeah. Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. I have a question next to propose to the both of you, whomever would like to answer first. But Mike, you've spent a lot of time both in the military and in the church, and there's a general phrase that goes around that is, "What hurts you cannot heal you." And I had a question as to like whether you thought that could apply to the church largely or the military, considering that both institutions have played a great part in the historic and contemporary roles of historic genocide and then the ongoing cultural genocide of the Native American people. That is an example of how they've been hurt. But military service also allows people to have greater social or economic mobility as well as access to higher education. And the church, as much as it has hurt, has also been very instrumental in things like grassroots human activism. So I was just wondering if you think that phrase could be accurately applied to the church or military.
Yes and no. If that sounds confusing, because it's a confusing, unclear dynamic that's going on. What hurts you cannot heal you. I understand that. I understand the legacy of genocide at the hands of the military, at the hands of the federal government, at the hands of the churches. But I want to add this also to continue that. As you mentioned, the phrase is, "What hurts you cannot heal you." I want to continue, show the other side of that same coin. The other side of that coin says, what hurts you can make you strong. Mm-hmm. So poverty for me made me strong. My opposition to the church made me strong. Mm-hmm. My moral conscience in the military as a witness to a military dictatorship made me strong. I would not have come out stronger had I not participated, in being a witness to a fascist military dictatorship in El Salvador. Fighting my own tribal government at the same time I was fighting my own church and United States Border Patrol. Yes, they were and can be very oppressive if you're not strong. So out of those struggles, I became stronger. And so I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, if I could just, I just want to underline some of the great things that Mike said there. And I think one of the things that you're already getting a sense of is how Mike's oral history is such a great example of how complex modern Native life is. In fact, the name of the book, the title that we gave it, "What Side Are You On," was meant to kind of call exactly this dynamic into question. One of the things that is so remarkable about Mike's life is he's in and out of these institutions in so many ways. He's in it. He's he's following some of the rules, and then he's actively criticizing almost every community or organization or institution that he's a part of. Mike has been both a very faithful person within those constraints, but also a very vocal critic of those as well, which I think is really one of the things that's really interesting. And it allows, people have told us that the book, some said that they were afraid they were going to be preached to about immigration or about U.S. military policy, and while Mike has a clear moral compass, you also see that the journey's not linear. It's gone in all kinds of different directions. It's complicated, and the question you asked about the church is a great example as well. Because you should, just to remind folks, Mike is also the recipient of an honorary doctorate of theology from San Francisco Theological Seminary. So, even as he critiques the church, he is also himself deeply immersed in these traditions. And so, what I just want to wrap this part up by saying is that the military and the church, they're not monolithic, and Native peoples have always navigated and negotiated those institutions in really complicated ways. They've indigenized both the military and the church in really complicated ways, and so you can't really kind of separate these experiences as neatly as one would like to. It's always a little bit messy.
Yes, I have to say that's probably one of my favorite parts of the books, and we often fall into the trap of black and white thinking. It's something is either all good or it is all bad, when in reality, as you said, life is much, much more complicated. And once you can embrace that things are complicated and nuance is important, once you're speaking not only about individuals like Mike's experience, but also more broadly when you speak about organizations, it does provide a little bit of comfort, because things aren't all bad or all good. You can find either the bad or the good in any given situation. So thank you. Mike, can you speak to how the military empowers Native veterans to become more involved in Native activism?
Most precisely, it teaches you leadership. It teaches you leadership. In the first place, it teaches you to follow orders. Before you can become a leader, you have to be a very good follower. Nobody wants an inexperienced leader. The leader must have demonstrated leadership traits prior to becoming assigned that leadership position. And so I think when I came out of the military, much more self-confident, much more mature, much more readily available to assume leadership roles. And it was that sense of leadership that helped me enter and negotiate my water justice ministry. It was nothing less than that. It was water justice. And so those military experiences in peacetime and in El Salvador prepared me for the hardships, having face-to-face confrontation with armed Border Patrol agents on my reservation. Hostile church members of the Presbyterian Church asking me, Mike, why are you aiding, abetting This is people of color calling other people of color. It reminds me of what I've been saying. We as indigenous people, we who were once victimized, we are now the victimizers. Because many of those people migrants coming to the reservation were and are indigenous peoples from Central America and from Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So here you have this case of indigenous migrants dying by the hundreds on Tohono land. And my tribal government and my church and the Border Patrol are criticizing me for offering them water. And so that is what I had to deal with. And being in the military prepared me for those moral battles. It was very painful for me to battle with tribal members, tribal leadership, tribal police, superintendent of public safety, and even the tribal chairman. But I knew that I had the moral obligation to put out water. That where there was human suffering and human death, it was happening all around us. It was happening within 5 miles of my church. And nobody on the Tohono Nation was doing anything about it. And these deaths included pregnant indigenous women. I had a search party many years ago, indigenous woman from Mexico who was 7.5 months pregnant. She got separated from her group because she had blisters and she couldn't keep up. And we went looking for her several weeks later. We never found her. We found her bloodied socks, but her and her baby perished. So this is the hypocrisy. This is the moral hypocrisy, even in Indian country, it pains me to say. But this is what I was dealing with. You know, I repeat myself, but it's worth repeating. We who once were the victims are now the victimizers.
Yes. Thank you for sharing. Did you have to grieve the loss of support or the lack of support that you received during your water justice campaign? And how did you come to terms with the fact that you're doing something that is a human right, but you're facing pushback from your own people?
It was very painful. Not so much Mike Wilson versus the government or governments, that's plural, of the Tohono Nation. What was most painful was the pushback from tribal members. It was so painful to the point where I was threatened by the superintendent for public safety on the nation, who oversees law enforcement, search and rescue, fire department. I was threatened by him, the superintendent for public safety, who was not a tribal member, by the way. He wasn't even indigenous. He was a retired white Air Force colonel. He was threatening me with banishment. Banishment means that I would never, ever be able to go on tribal land. Mm-hmm. That was the most painful for me, because for all of them, not to be able to go on our sacred soil. See, the land, the soil, we are of the soil, we are of Mother Earth. That umbilical cord is never severed. we are always attached to our mother. And for this white lieutenant colonel be threatening me and all of them that I couldn't come on the land, that was most insulting for me as an O'odham and as an O'odham citizen. So those were the battles that I had to contend with. But the point is, I knew I was doing the right thing. That in my O'odham heart, we are taught what is right. You serve the people above yourself. You are a servant to the village. You are a servant to your elders. You are a servant to the poor and the hungry. But not just tribal members, everybody. We are a part of the human family, and we are all brothers and sisters. And so for the nation, and I say the nation because remember, the superintendent of public safety is the face of the nation. So I want to, embarrassingly, it embarrasses me to drag in my tribal governments. But even my tribal government must be held morally accountable for migrant deaths.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's so interesting. Going back just a little bit, the way that you talked about how being in the military, learning to be a follower strengthens your ability to then become a leader going forward because you know what it takes to follow. Therefore, you know what it takes and you can empathize with the people that you are leading. Thank you for sharing. Tony, could you talk a little bit about if there are any historical precedents as to why Native communities would self-isolate or refuse to help members of the greater Indigenous diaspora?
Yeah, that's another really big question, and I think one of the things that we need to keep in view was where we started the conversation, and that's really thinking about how colonialism continues to work. I mean, that's really one of the things that colonialism does is it separates, it divides, it isolates, it makes relations harder. It puts people in scarcity mindsets, and it pits people against each other. I think that's one of the things that we see hemispherically. It's also something you see, in Turtle Island. That's one of the things that Mike's story really illuminates. Other Native peoples did not create these problems that they are currently experiencing. These migration dynamics are a byproduct of imperial legacies, of capitalism, of the deeply uneven ways that some people have benefited greatly and many more people have suffered. Those things are connected. The prosperity of some in the global north has been a function of the poverty of others in the global south. And those kind of dynamics really make it difficult for us to see that people's actions are often within that big kind of framework. So in some ways, the table has kind of been set, and folks are already at the margins trying to eke things out. So when folks are facing these larger structural issues, they often find themselves in a really difficult situation, really a constrained situation. So I guess I want to just maybe broaden our conversation a little bit to remind ourselves that there are a lot of these structural factors that are really making these decisions so hard. And also just to say that solidarity is also possible. I mean, Mike's is a great example. The way he is kind of enacting this tradition of hospitality. That's of course an indigenous tradition across many tribes, and you still do see that. So I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. There are definitely attempts to have cross-border solidarity. The O'odham Nation itself, is divided by the settler colonial boundary, but yet there are still odds of peoples who come together despite that boundary. But it's that kind of relationality is made harder by Border Patrol, which is just an extension of these kind of colonial dynamics that have been around for a long time.
Yes, and I don't mean to single out the Tohono Nation as being like cruel or mean or something like that, because they were also, as talked about in the book, put in a very unique and very hard situation where they are closing more accessible traditional border crossings, and that forced and created a bottleneck, forcing a lot of migrants to go through a much more dangerous, much more treacherous area, which lies near and around the nation. So they have been victimized by the United States government and then are put in a situation where they are now facing, on top of other issues that they may have in the nation, an immigrant crisis where, as I believe I read in the book, up to like 1,500 migrants a day are coming through this area, which does not probably have the resources to take care of that many people every single day coming through the nation, which then led them to inviting, which might surprise some people, Border Patrol to coming into the nation to, kind of help deal with that problem. But, unfortunately has led to increasing things like police brutality and things of that nature. But Tony, I would like to talk a little bit about Native sovereignty and like, what are some of the most common misconceptions that you encounter around the idea of Native sovereignty versus the actual execution of Native sovereignty?
Yeah, this is a big theme of the book, and Mike has some very strong views on this, as you'll hear very shortly, I'm sure. But I think the major misconception that we have, broadly speaking, folks who live in the United States, is there's a misunderstanding of Native peoples as simply another racial group or an ethnic group rather than political entities. So on just a very fundamental level, there's a lack of understanding that indigenous nations are nations with sovereignty. That said, that sovereignty, and here I think Mike will have a lot to say, has often been honored in the breach. Has not been respected by the federal government. Even in the Supreme Court, in the famous phrase, called them domestic dependent nations. So already the sovereignty comes with lots of asterisks and kind of qualifications, and in reality, it gets very messy and it gets very complicated. Nevertheless, Native peoples, I think the insistence that they are entitled to their own self-determination and they themselves are enacting their own futurity remains an important principle that I think Native peoples are really illustrating on a daily basis in struggles. You can think about from the American Indian movement up until the present, and even beyond our borders, Native peoples continue to insist on their own right to their own relations and their own right for their own self-determination. So it is a tricky one, but I think that would be the major misconception that most people still in the U.S. have not really understood.
Gotcha. And Mike, can you tell us why is true Native sovereignty so important as opposed to like what we like the way it's currently being practiced?
Let me interject here. I don't necessarily use the word sovereignty when it comes to Indian country. I prefer to use the term the myth of sovereignty. That for me, I know that we as indigenous peoples and we as indigenous governments, we like to wave the flag of sovereignty. But it begs the question that I'm asked many times. I'm always asked, Mike, why is the Border Patrol on the Tohono Nation? I thought you were a sovereign country. I thought you were a sovereign nation. And that begs the question, precisely to the point, what is sovereignty? See, sovereignty is not absolute. It's conditional. We have sovereignty only because the United States Congress awarded us sovereignty. We did not bestow sovereignty upon ourselves. It was granted to us by the federal government. As Congress gives, Congress can take away. And so that's precisely the point. But I'm asked that question by visitors following my public lectures, and I repeat the question because it's so central to this discussion. Mike, why is the Border Patrol on the thorn of the nation? I thought you were a sovereign country. Well, no, we're not. But to answer their question, the Border Patrol is a federal law enforcement agency. Every federally recognized tribe with reservation land, those lands are first and foremost, according to Congress, federal trust land. They have the same federal trust status as the national parks. But because first and foremost reservations are federal trust lands, the United States Border Patrol and Homeland Security have law enforcement jurisdiction on all federal trust lands, including the so-called sovereign nation lands. That's why the Border Patrol is on Autumn Nation land, because they can. And as far as I know, for the last 30, 40 years, the Autumn Nation has never contested that. Mm-hmm. Nor are they ever willing to contest the power of the federal government being an Indian country. And this speaks for every federally recognized tribe in this country. Because what goes down on Autumn, that Border Patrol can be in your backyard tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing that you can do about it.
Gotcha.
And so I hope that illustrates my we're in this sort of very confusing position. And as I ask in the book, what's my definition of sovereignty? And I ask this is the litmus question. This is the test question, the paramount question in Indian country. Can the nation kick the Border Patrol off our land? If the answer is yes, we're a sovereign nation. If the answer is no, we are not a sovereign nation. And so unless that question, that question is not even being asked. Because it was forced Indian country to make a decision. Recognized tribes versus Congress. And as I had a tribal friend of mine who used to be on the Legislative Council, Mike, nobody wants to bite the hand that feeds them. Meaning, we tribal people, tribal nations, we receive federal funds from the United States government every year. And tribal governments and entities do not want to risk losing federal appropriations. See, because we want our cake and eat it too. Now, speaking specifically of the Autumn Nation, who has many very profitable casinos. So we want our casino profits, but we also want our federal appropriations at the same time. So we want our cake, casino profits, and we want to eat it too. We want continued and increasing federal appropriations. So do you think anybody is going to stand up to the Border Patrol, which is the face of the United States government in Indian country? Absolutely not. And it goes back to the question: what is sovereignty? See, but nobody's even asking that question. That's the most fundamental existential questions for indigenous people. Sovereignty, who? Limited, sovereignty, conditional sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
As I say, don't get me started.
As Mike is showing, this is a contentious topic, as you know now. And I think one of the things that the book does is it does raise this question. And I don't know if there's an issue in the field of indigenous politics that is more contested and more contentious than this question of sovereignty, and for many of the reasons that Mike just mentioned. But I do want to also add to what Mike said is that there are many moments where struggles for self-determination, if we want to use that term instead of sovereignty for the moment, clearly are alive. And in fact, the history of Daybreak Star is a wonderful example. As you all know better than I do, mobilization, the occupation of Fort Lawton, the Bernie White Bear and others were able to really create this vibrant pocket of self-determination in the city of Seattle, which continues to indigenize the airwaves, as you all are doing right now. So I think that, kind of we can think about, rather than think of sovereignty, as Mike put it, as just kind of coming from above, being given by Congress, forms of sovereignty can also emerge kind of from below. They can be enacted by indigenous people. Indigenous people throughout the world don't always stop to ask permission for doing things the way they would like to do them, and the way they've always done them. They enact their sovereignty on an everyday basis. So that's a different understanding what sovereignty can be, in addition to the forms that Mike already talked about. And it's a form that has had all kinds of consequences. Again, just to stick with Daybreak Star for a second, the book is a really wonderful collaboration between a tribal member of the Tohono Nation and a Chicano scholar. El Centro de la Raza here in Seattle is a really important Latinx, Chicanx organization, but it really is a byproduct of the occupation of Fort Lawton. Roberto Maestas, Bernie White Bear were great friends, and that the occupations of the American Indian movement really inspirational to the Chicano movement. And so in many ways, these kinds of forms of struggle are a different way of understanding the possibility, the potential of forms of sovereignty that don't go from the top down, they come from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're rounding off to the last question of our interview, and I just wanted to wonder, based on both of your experiences working with different human rights organizations and groups, how can non-native support communities in their fight and advocacy for sovereignty?
How can non-natives support native sovereignty? Was that the question now?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, again, my preference, my word of choice is the myth of sovereignty. How can we fight for the myth of sovereignty until we're truly sovereign? More concisely, non-native people need to hold indigenous people as their moral equals. Here's why, and I may be missing the point, but maybe I'll circle around to it in the indigenous fashion that we eventually. We don't talk directly to the question sometimes. In an oral tradition of speaking, we eventually get to it. So, and I hope I answered the question in a roundabout way. Until we're the white man's moral equals, we cannot ask that question about sovereignty. Sovereignty is in the future. But for the present moment, white America has to acknowledge us as its moral equal. And why do I say that? because white America, including many of my social justice peers in the Tucson area, are silent when it comes to migrant deaths on Autumn Nation lands. I've been saying for over 20 years, 50% of migrant deaths in the Tucson sector of the Border Patrol are on my tribal lands. So social justice members, my community members, where is your moral outrage when 50% of migrants are dying on Indian lands? They remain silent. They rage against the Border Patrol, and rightly so. But where's your moral outrage against the tribal government? They remain silent, as if silence is a neutral, safe, non-judgmental position. They don't want to be asked that question. This is why I'm a persona non grata, even within the social justice community. How can you pontificate and take this moral high ground versus the United States Border Patrol and saying nothing when human beings are dying on tribal land? So I think that has to precede the question of sovereignty. We have no right to ask for sovereignty when we have migrant blood on our hands up to our elbows. Stop the bleeding, stop the blood first. And then we may have the luxury of versus the United States government.
Okay. Do you think it's in part, like to use the phrase, like the reason that some non-native human rights activist groups are reticent or worried about calling out similar behavior like between the Otoham Nation and the Border Patrol is because there is a sense of guilt, like over the way Indigenous people have been treated historically, so they don't feel as though they have the right to call them out in as strong or even at all the way that they would call out Border Patrol?
You're hitting the moral nail on the head. That's what I think my social justice colleagues, it's what I call, they live under the burden of historical guilt. That nobody, especially white Americans, want to say anything bad against Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, they remain silent. And I was reminded, I had a meeting a month ago with a young PhD candidate from France, and she went out with one of the water runs, I think with No More Deaths. And in the vehicle riding back, they went to service a water station off the reservation. And she asked the question of them, why aren't you putting out water on the nation? That's where they're dying. And they had a political response. We don't interfere with tribal politics. And my response to her said, next time you ask that question, say, look, I'm asking you a moral question, and I expect and I demand a moral response. Not a politically, this is not about political gamesmanship. Pregnant women, children, infants, elderly, and young people are dying on the nation as we speak. You know, that's that's where I was 25 years ago, and that's where I am today. If anything, has gotten worse. And the voting, as you hit the nail on the head, it's the burden of the white man's guilt. Don't ask any embarrassing questions. Look what we did to the Native Americans. First we tried to kill them. That almost worked. Then we tried to Christianize them. That sort of worked. But they're still here.
Yes.
They failed.
Yes, they did. Tony, do you think that learning a less black and white version of history, a more nuanced version of history would help alleviate some of that guilt that non-native people feel criticizing a group that has been so historically marginalized and had so many war crimes, genocide committed against them? Do you think a more deep and nuanced understanding of history would help alleviate some of that guilt that people feel?
I want to agree. I hope that would help, but I don't know if alleviating the guilt is the goal, right? But I do think that you're right that at minimum, folks should have a better understanding, because I unfortunately the bar is really low. Most people don't really understand the history of the land where they sit or they stand, right? Most people don't understand the native peoples who they may share these lands with. So I think before folks get too much on their soapbox, they should really stop and just learn about where they live, learn about the peoples who are there, and also learn about the broader dynamics that we're talking about. I mean, one of the things the book really tries to do is invite people to ask these questions. Why are so many Central Americans coming to the United States now? It's not just because they decided one day, oh, let's move to Seattle. That's way better. It's a much broader story about why folks were forced to leave their countries. Similarly, why are Native peoples facing these difficult situations? Well, we have to understand something about the way politics and economics works. And we also have to understand that there are other worldviews that may be worth taking seriously. I think one of the things you talked about, how the military was a hierarchy, the university is also a hierarchy. And we've been privileging certain kinds of knowledges for a long time and excluding others. And if we would also take seriously Native understandings about relationality, that could also be a game changer as we're experiencing this climate crisis that is everywhere, but we also don't want to think about. So I think just really understanding, if folks could just spend a little bit more time in American Indian Studies departments, just read books by Native authors, they'd understand that there are lots of voices that could educate people on how people can really relate differently. There's a really great book that I like called Becoming Kin, and the author's name is escaping me right now, but one of the points that she makes so powerfully is that you don't have to be a settler. You can find a different way to relate with people. You can become an advocate, an ally. You can aspire to find a different way of relating with the people around you. Like settlers dispossess, they take. Settler is something you do. It's not something that you are. And if you rethink your relationship with the people in the lands where you are, that could be a huge step forward.
Gotcha. Yes, that's a very good point. Alleviating the guilt should probably not be your goal if what you're doing is learning more about history, but maybe more integrating and learning to live with the fact that that is a part of our history that should be something that we should all feel guilty that we, us as humans were capable of doing, but that is what happened. And holding on to it, especially so tightly, doesn't seem to be helping. It seems to be pushing people further away from the goal, which is, equality and equity for all people, as opposed to telling ourselves we can't speak on morality, certain things, simply because of our identity or which group that we belong to. But that was actually my last question. And I just wanted to say to the both of you, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me. The book, What Side Are You On? I finished reading this probably about a week ago. And I don't know, you probably can't tell, but I spent just annotating, just writing through the entire book because it was so good. I just love the way that the combination between hearing an individual person's lived experience, how they have changed and grown as a person, and then after each chapter having Tony having your insights into the historical perspective and how an individual narrative fits into the greater, American global, story that we should all learn and be a part of. So thank you absolutely so much for being here. And I know that the two of you are Tony, you are here in Washington with us, but Mike, you will be here in October. And I just wanted to have you guys tell us a little bit about some of the events that you guys will have coming up in October, just so that everybody knows.
Sure. Well, maybe the one that is most publicly accessible is Mike and I will be doing a book reading at Elliott Bay Book Company on October 11th, 7 p.m. We'll be doing other events at the University of Washington around the book, but Mike is also promoting a film that he's in. Maybe you want to say a word about that, Mike?
Yeah, the title of the film is The Long Walk of Carlos Guerrero. I play myself in it. In the film, I am a human rights volunteer, and I assist to migrants crossing. It's never stated, it's implied that they have crossed. The young woman is from El Salvador, and the man is returning to Mexico City. Returning to New York City from Mexico, and they get separated in the Arizona desert, and it's implied that they're crossing the Tohono Nation, and my character helps them get out of the desert and get to New York. So we have one confirmed. We don't have the precise date yet or the time, but it's you can find it on the Seattle Latino Film Festival. I don't know if their schedule's been posted yet.
It might be posted, but we do have the venue. We'll be at the Henry Art Gallery on the 10th of October at 4:30.
Yeah. 4:30 to 6:45, screening The Long Walk Home of Carlos Guerrero at Henry Art Gallery. And as well, if anyone listening follows Daybreak Star on either Instagram or Facebook, we will also be providing these same dates, all of the information in the lead up to the October 11th date, just so that we can get as many eyes and ears, hopefully, bottoms in seats there that we can, because I cannot say enough how amazing reading this book was. Just like a change in perspective, especially in this time where we hear a lot about immigration policy, but we don't hear from people on the ground who are either immigrating or who live along the border, which is, very important. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nat.
Yes.
This was great.
Okay. It was so nice to talk to you.
Same here.
See you in Seattle.
Yes, absolutely. You will see me there October 11th. I'm going to have my book signed. That's what.
You got it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you guys so much. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.